cannot now even conduct a discourse on technology without invoking the specter of Frankenstein's monster.
And now next up is a super exciting session, really going back to first causes, as Heino Falke said. What is the seed of all these ideas that are proliferating and turning into matter in front of our eyes? And that is science fiction. Our next speaker is an absolute star of the science fiction world, the most awarded science fiction writer. And it is out of the stories that people have read as children, stories that people have watched, the Dune series, the Star Trek series, that really have fired the imagination of some of the scientists and technologists who are putting their lives and their intelligence and their billions of dollars into creating alternate worlds and different realities from what we experience. And so, as I said, in a way, this is like going back to first causes, first principles, first movers. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to welcome on stage, next up, a powerhouse of imagination. And while we're talking about technologies, he thinks stories themselves are a technology. And speaking with him is a very great admirer of his work, the executive editor of Lucid Lines, a very valued and dear colleague of all of us, part of our team, and just short of a fangirl, a passionate admirer of his work. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on stage Ken Liu and Ritika Passi.
So just a couple of sessions ago, Shoma mentioned that we think of ourselves as thought seeders. In this session, I am thrilled to be in conversation with someone whose day job it is to also be a thought seeder, but through stories. Ken, I have devoured your short stories. I've often felt that gut punch of emotion as you spotlight the personal, even as you're talking about AI and blockchain and digital mind uploading. And I have often felt goosebumps at the sheer ingenuity of some of your twists and turns and the plots that you put together. And I am excited to bring our audience today into your worldview and your world building. So we will dive straight in. So as Shoma mentioned, you have a phrase that stories are humanity's oldest technology. How and why?
So I have a pretty expansive definition of technology. The way I think about it is technology is, you have to go back to the roots of the word, right? So because I'm a writer, I'm very focused on language. And I want to get back to this a little bit later. But if you break down technology, it's techne and logia, and that means craft plus discourse. So technology, when understood this way, is really a discourse about craft, or a speech, a speaking about shaping. Okay, that makes sense. So what does that mean in practical terms? I think technology is the most unique human trait, if you will. Humans are the only known creatures so far who can imagine things that have never existed and then make them real, right? That's technology. So anytime we take something that is not real, something we imagine, and make it manifest in this world, in this universe, that's practicing technology. That's us speaking to the universe and making our words true. And the way we do that, obviously, the most fundamental way we do that is storytelling. Stories are a way we shape our experience and reality, as we just sort of discussed by the previous speaker. The way our mind perceives and makes sense of everything it perceives, the way we craft a narrative to explain everything about this universe. I like to say that the universe is fundamentally random, and that it's meaningless. But we humans cannot accept that. So we have to construct meaning out of these random bits and pieces. And that is storytelling. That is literally how we speak to the universe, how we shape it, and that's our oldest technology.
In fact, you call humans imagination machines, right?
That's right. We are imagination machines because, again, we think about things that have not existed in the universe, and then we make them real. We bring them into existence. That's fundamentally what it means to be human.
So now I'm going to come to the kind of stories that you tell. Science fiction, or speculative fiction, or tech fiction, call it what you will. So the tech bros of Silicon Valley have all admitted to being avid science fiction fans. Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse is apparently a seed that came from a 1992 science fiction novel. Jeff Bezos is a Trekkie. He's a Star Trek fan. Elon Musk, apparently, if it were not for a Scottish science fiction author, he would not have looked to the skies and launched the biggest satellite network that exists today. So what is the utility of science fiction? In fact, you have said that science fiction isn't about forecasting the future. It's about making the future.
So the reason why I sort of get a little sensitive about this subject is because as an artist, right, I'm always being asked to justify my existence, right? When people find out you're an artist, they sort of look at you weird, right? They say, well, what do you actually do, right? You don't cure diseases. You don't really make things. You don't really make anything tangible. You don't even make much money. And in the world that we live in, the more money you make, the more value you have, right? The less money you make, it seems like the less valuable you are. So a lot of science fiction writers sort of react to this by trying to justify what they do in a very instrumentalist way, which I don't really like. There's this idea that science fiction writers are somehow prophets. We're supposed to predict the future, and then Silicon Valley just, they take our ideas and then make them real. I've actually done a lot of sort of research into this. There's almost no truth at all to this idea. Science fiction writers have never been able to get the future right, and they don't do much in terms of predicting the future. But nonetheless, I think science fiction writers are actually very valuable, not in a monetary sense, not in a instrumentalist sense, but in the sense of science fiction writers are mythology makers, right? So what do I mean by that? One of my favorite sci-fi writers, Ursula K. Le Guin, basically, she made this point, which is that science fiction really is the newest province of that ancient empire called fantasy. And what is science fiction? It's mythology for the modern age. What science fiction writers really do is to go into the collective unconscious and extract the gods and monsters who rule our modernity and give them names, right? So again, prior to Frankenstein, right, we had no concept of Frankenstein's monster. But once it became a part of our vocabulary and our collective imagination, Frankenstein's monster became every bit as real as Apollo or Dionysus, right? Frankenstein's monster is the way we articulate and give shape to our fears about technology. We cannot now even conduct a discourse on technology without invoking the specter of Frankenstein's monster. That's what science fiction is actually about, in the sense that it excavates monsters and gods from the collective unconscious, which then become the way we make sense of our technological present and future.
And what's interesting about Ken's work is that he never presents a binary. Who are the gods of our age? Who are the monsters of our age? We often tend to think of AI as a binary. In fact, we've got a session tomorrow which is very aptly titled Abundance and Apocalypse. We often tend to think of technology in these two frames, but Ken's story dig a little bit deeper. Here, Ken, I want to ask you about how you engage with technology through your stories. Do you use them as a tool? Do you use them as a way to put the familiar in the unfamiliar? How do you bring alive this idea of technology that you've mentioned is a craft, right, to your stories?
So I think about technology fundamentally as a way we express who we are, right? There's this very old idea in culture where technology is seen as the opposite of humanity, right? Human nature is seen as somehow the opposite of technology, and we need to get rid of technology to be more human. I fundamentally disagree with this conception because I think it's a misunderstanding of what technology is. As I mentioned earlier, technology is the way we speak to the universe, that we manifest our mental patterns into the world, whether it's in the form of machines or stories or custom or maps or systems of measurement. They are all ways for us to reshape the world we live in through our imagination. So what practically that means is you cannot understand human nature without understanding human technology or human craft. In the same way that you cannot make sense of bees without understanding beehives or beavers without understanding beaver dams. You have to understand human nature through the way we express that nature via our technology. And so all of my stories are fundamentally about humans expressing their values through their craft.
And if you follow the session visuals, the very lovely session visuals we have, you will notice that there are snippets of some of Ken's stories. And in fact, to make it a little bit closer, more immediate, the kind of stories that Ken builds, here are a couple of examples. There is an AI researcher who is building a machine to digitize minds, to build digital copies. At the same time, her mother suffers from dementia and is rapidly losing her memory. So one would think, okay, the obvious question would be to ask, is a digital copy an exact replica of the person? If this scientist were to upload her mother's existing memory before it fails into a digital version, if that would suffice. But Ken goes one step further. He asks, what is consciousness? Instead of it being a world just in your inner world, just in your mind, consciousness is something that we experience through relationships, through interaction with each other, because that is how we can say, hey, I feel this, I think this, I am this. This is my story. This is your story. Ken, I also want to ask you that here I've given an example, and it's about very much human values and how we will think of ourselves and how we will build our societies and how we will engage with technology and what that means for what we think about memory and loss and relationships. But you also often hark back to the past. Science fiction, speculative fiction, it's all about looking forward. And you have this very nice phrase. You say that you use technology to punk the past into the future. Could you explain that concept, please?
Sure. So the origin of this is from the way I think about modernity, right? So all of us are modern individuals, right? Or we like to think of ourselves as modern individuals, and we live in a particular modernity that we share. I would say that the vocabulary and the grammar of this modernity that we share is primarily derived from the European Renaissance, right? And what happened during the European Renaissance? That was a moment where all these new ideas about capitalism, about science, about technology, about the relationship between governments and the governed were coming to the forefront, right? And the way these concepts were exploding into being, and people needed a way to talk about it, right? In the same way that science fiction authors excavate gods and monsters from the collective unconscious, the people during the Renaissance excavated their own past, the Greco-Latin antiquity, and dug up all of these roots and reformulated them into the words of our modernity. So all the words we now use to talk about modernity, physics, chemistry, democracy, etc., economics, all of these words are not vernacular words. They're not Anglo-Saxon words, they're not German words, they're not words derived from these vernaculars. They're words dug up from a Greco-Latin past. So if you wish, you could argue that modernity, as we experience it, is really Greco-Roman punk, because we take bits of the Greco-Roman past and we put them to new uses. We express our modernity using bits of the past in the same way that Christian churches were built from bits and pieces of pagan temples. And so here's the thing, right? Everybody across this globe shares this one modernity, and it's derived from such a small piece of the past. All of us share much, much larger different traditions all around the globe. Traditions that have other words, other concepts that are just waiting to be excavated, like science fiction authors excavating the collective unconscious. I feel like all of us can excavate this global heritage of indigenous traditions and punk them into a new, expanded view of modernity and future in the same way that the Renaissance took the Greco-Roman past and gave us the modernity we have today.
To distill that a little bit, we were talking earlier, and one parallel I gave to what Ken is talking about is the fact that if you are multilingual, if you speak multiple languages, it has been proven, there have been studies done about it, that when you speak one language, you are one type of personality and behavior, and if you speak in another, you exhibit a different behavior, a different personality. So now imagine if we imagined the world, or we talked about technology and values and the kind of worlds that we want to build in different languages. That's just one example of what alternate modernities a path that they could take, or what that could mean, or what that could, the path that could be shaped. Ken, you have brought to life a new genre. You call it silkpunk, and it has something to do with alternate modernities, right? Could you please explain to the audience what
Yeah, definitely. So let me go back a little bit and talk about these paradigms that we're talking about, right? So paradigms are these pervasive structures and frameworks that surround us that both determine what kind of questions we can ask and also what kind of answers we end up seeking, right? So one way to sort of think about it is the metaphor of a glass, right? So if you pour water into the glass, the water takes on the shape of the glass. The glass is what enables you to even pick up the water. Without it, you can't pick up the water at all. But at the same time, the water just takes on the shape of the glass, even though the water can take on many different shapes. But this is the shape that it's going to take. So the glass is basically the paradigm that we live under. And when you're deep within the glass, you think it is basically the only possibility, because without it, you can't even think at all. And yet, it constrains, obviously, the kind of questions you can ask and the kind of solutions you come up with. So let's go back to that whole language example again, right? So it's kind of fun to talk to this audience because I think almost all of you are multilingual, and it's actually very rare to find a monolingual person here in India. But if you are multilingual, then you know that there are certain things that you can think about much more effectively in one language versus another. The problem with all of the modern world sharing one language, English in this case, is that we think English is the end-all and be-all of all human cognition. If it cannot be expressed in English, then it just doesn't exist. Well, it's sort of true. You have to be able to express it in order to even talk about it. But English is like that glass, or not English specifically, but just the modern shared language in which we speak about science and rationality and all the rest of it. This language is a paradigm. It contains within it a set of frameworks that we use to think about the questions we can ask, and to come up with solutions. But there are lots of other languages, lots of other shapes that we can use to pick up the water. And silkpunk is my concept for trying to excavate these other possibilities, these other ways of thinking about our future and of questioning the paradigms that we have. Because we live immersed in this particular path to where we are today, we think of it as the only solution, but it's not. There are other possibilities that if you go into, you realize just how contingent the modernity we have actually is and how accidental everything is. It doesn't have to be just this one way. And if there are other solutions to our problems that we have not even thought about or can't think about within the current paradigm, then we need to excavate other indigenous traditions to do exactly that.
You know, so you have previously given an example, a really fun example, a couple of examples actually. One was, you shared that at one point in time, about 40% of cars used to be steam powered, and 20-30% were electric. And yet, in the 1900s, we went coal powered, fossil fuel powered. There was no one way for that car to have been, but it went along one way, and so today we think there's only one way for that car to be, and now we're trying to transition to electric, which apparently already existed at one point in time. Thomas Edison had built a prototype for a car built on electricity. Then there's another example, Ken, that you've shared, right, about touch screens, right? Apparently, the way that we use our phones today, this was apparently not the only way that scientists, I think, 20, 30 teams that at one point were trying to crack how to make, an immersive experience, how to make a screen a more immersive experience. But what won out was the version that we now all use today, which means that tech isn't inevitable. And today, and I want to talk about this because I think that's an important takeaway, especially because today, life can kind of feel out of control, right? Tom Friedman, he talked about the 3 accelerations: climate change, technology, and conflict. We often feel that AI and technology is accelerating at such speeds that it's becoming omnipresent, that it's becoming all knowledgeable. What role or what space does that leave for us? Today, we began this conference talking about, hey, if robots today are becoming more like humans, what does that mean for how we differentiate ourselves from machines, right? So if you could provide, or not provide, but I think that's an interesting takeaway from what you were saying, that there's no one way and that technology doesn't need to be inevitable. So you have a series, Dandelion Dynasty, an epic series, and that is your silkpunk offering. That's where you have developed this genre, if I'm correct. And if you want to share some characteristics of this genre, I think it'll be fun because I think it'll help crystallize to the audience what exactly, the alternate modernity that you're kind of pushing through this series or in silkpunk.
Right. So, the way to think about it is to realize, right, storytelling is our oldest technology. And so it is all pervasive in the way we think about the universe, sometimes to our own detriment, right? I've often pointed out that it's very difficult for humans to understand things that are not narratives, and we tend to fit things into narratives even when they are not narratives. So for example, anything having to do with genetics and evolution, it is very, very, very difficult for humans to not attribute to these statistical issues some sort of deep teleological meaning, right? This is why we have all of these terrible social Darwinism interpretation of evolution, all these very bad pseudoscientific understandings of population differences. It's because we can't resist putting a story onto something. And in practice, what that means is we have a very, very flawed understanding of history. History often is a lot of contingency and a lot of people trying to make sense of it in the moment. And then afterwards, we turn that into a story and then we say that was inevitable. So over and over again, in practical terms, we're deceived into thinking that the way something was done was the way it had to be done. So those in the US, for example, are very, very trapped into the way we ended up developing our technological history. We had landlines first, then we developed cell phone networks. So to us, it seems inconceivable that a country can jump straight into cell phone networks without having gone through the landline evolution. But the reality is lots of countries have just skipped over it and gone directly to cell phone networks. There is a tendency that just because we got there by a certain way, we think everybody else has to do it the same way. I mean, that's obviously a very trivial example, but that kind of trap shows up all the time in the way we think about socioeconomic development, about geopolitics. All this talk about various inevitabilities in history, to me, it's just nonsense. The idea that, when you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it is nonsense. It's people who know a little bit of history who are hell-bent on repeating it because it's all they know. That's the reality of it. And my point is, we need to, I'm a storyteller, so I know why we love stories, but we also have to be very, very cautious about the way stories warp our minds. Not everything in the universe is a narrative, and oftentimes the narrative we happen to have is not the only one that's inevitable. So silkpunk is basically my attempt to tell a story of how we can get to modernity using other indigenous traditions, in this case, an East Asian tradition. What would it be like to try to solve problems of empire, of capitalism, of democratic governance, of all the sort of things that we think of as hallmarks of modernity? How would you solve these problems using classical East Asian philosophical roots? How would you punk those things into what we would recognize as modernity, but also in many ways looks very different from the life that we actually live?
So, we began with saying technology isn't inevitable. Now we have the corollary to that. Technology isn't only not inevitable, but it's also a choice that we make. And I think at our present moment, we definitely know that we have choices to make, the kind of technology that we want to develop, where we want to use it, and assimilate in our society. But Ken, the characteristics I was hoping you would bring up is exactly as you're saying, that you reach for East Asian cultures. So imagine airships that are not made of metal and steel, but are made of bamboo and silk. Imagine submarines that rise up like whales do. Imagine heroes that are not the heroes that we would think that are shown in Marvel movies or in the Western culture, but engineers as heroes. And here I do have to point out that Ken is a technologist, a former technologist. He was a programmer, a software engineer, and then he was a corporate lawyer, and then he was a tech litigator, and now he is a storyteller. So, Ken, in a way, you are writing about yourself being a hero? Is that safe to say?
Well, that's what we always do, right?
Okay, we are going to bring up AI, do not worry. But before we do, a quick question. Is there anything about the way that technology is unfolding now that scares you?
I wouldn't say scares me. I mean, I guess it does scare me a little bit, but it's a little diffuse in terms of my fears, right? So I think we live in a very wonderful moment where there's a lot of new innovation, a lot of very exciting, interesting developments. But my fear is that so much of what we're seeing now is a concentration of power, either in terms of the concentration of knowledge or the concentration of the kind of resources needed to make these technologies practical. Only very, very, very powerful companies backed by nation states, a few nation states can do this. And that to me is a terribly insecure position to be in. Over and over again, I think, I'm obviously narrowizing a little bit here, but it seems to me that the pattern is when a technology is very diffuse, meaning it becomes open source, open knowledge, so that many, many, many different individuals can use the technology to speak, to express their values, that is a good thing, as opposed to technology being controlled by a few choke points. So for example, right, let's talk about our online app economy. The fact that anybody can write and craft an app to transform the economy, to make their dreams come true, to put their visions into practice is wonderful, right? It seems like a very democratic, open kind of technology. Until you realize that when a government wishes to stop one of these technologies, all it has to do is to go to Apple and Google and tell them to not put it in their stores. And that will end and destroy maybe 99% of the people from accessing these technologies. That is a terrible position to be in, that two players, easily manipulable and subject to government pressure, can just control our access to everything. To me, that is a nightmare scenario that we have put ourselves into, where we have allowed just a few individuals to have that much power over the rest of us. It seems like we have gone into a dystopia without naming it. I mean, no big brother ever had that kind of control. And yet we willingly put ourselves in this position. That's the kind of thing that I get scared about.
Ken, earlier when we were talking, you also mentioned that you're not scared that technology is going to make us isolated from each other, but that it's actually going to make us more self-absorbed.
So this has to do again with my whole concept of technology as an expression of human nature, right? So the problem with technology as I see it is not that it divorces us from our nature, but it's narcissistic. It makes us become absolutely, utterly absorbed only in our nature and not the rest of the universe. I think the danger of technology is this idea that artists, people always tell artists that they cannot just develop art by looking at more art. They have to actually experience the universe as it is. I mean, that's my fundamental objection to AI art, which today is largely about looking at existing examples of human art and then imitating art. You can't grow flowers on more flowers. You have to grow flowers on actual soil. And my view is that human nature, when it's completely self-absorbed in our own technological mirror, we trap ourselves in our own nature and fail to see the rest of the universe as it is. And our duty is to imagine things that have not existed in this universe and to bring it forth. That requires engagement with the universe, not merely with our own mental projections.
You cannot grow flowers from flowers. You have to grow flowers from soil. Now we come to AI, the zeitgeist of the moment. Ken has a wonderful analogy of how to think about AI, and it's not what you would expect.
So I think about AI in the following way. So because I'm a writer, writers are incredibly fearful about AI in this moment. There's this huge, how do I put it? There's almost an existential dread that writers are going to be displaced by machines. I'm not that worried about it because I think it's a misunderstanding of what AI is currently doing, and it's a misunderstanding of what the purpose of literary art actually is. So here's the analogy I use, right? I think the best way to think about AI is it's a new medium. It's a new medium for art. Notice what I'm trying to say here. It's not just a tool for making existing art or forms of existing art. It's actually a new medium. And the way to think about it is to think about the early days of cinema, right? What was the earliest form of cinema? It's motion pictures. It's this machine called the cinematograph, which is a machine to capture movement, kine, right? Movement, and to project it back. That's what cinema is about. Cinema is about capturing movement and projecting it back. I think it's a good analogy for what today's AI is doing. Today's AI being largely neural models trained on existing forms of human intellectual output and then generating imitations of it is basically a noematograph, meaning it's a subjectivity capturing machine and a projector of synthetic subjectivities, right? So what AI really is doing is, just like a camera, it captures the output of human subjectivity, and then it tries to play that thing back to us in a way to make us think that there's a synthetic subjectivity behind it. And my point is, in the same way that you observe the earliest motion pictures, and these were not very interesting motion pictures. They were basically records of a still camera being pointed at workers leaving a factory. They're images of people getting off a boat. And yet, there's something really compelling about watching these early films. Watching these early examples of motion pictures, I don't think anybody at the time could have imagined that one day we would have, Breaking Bad, or YouTube, or Instagram Reels, or any of the stuff that we now use. I mean, motion pictures are now the primary way in which we tell stories, and the most powerful way in which we embody narratives. There's no way this could have been envisioned back when that medium was first invented. So I think that's the potential of AI today. AI as a subjectivity capturing and projecting machine can develop into incredible potential futures. And you can observe that today in the way people use AI, right? Why do I think AI is most useful as a medium versus as a tool for existing art? Well, here's a concrete example. If you go onto YouTube and you search for how to write a novel using AI, you will get thousands and thousands of hits, okay? People trying to tell you, this is why it's fun, this is how you do it. But if you search for, here is a novel written by AI that I really recommend that you read, you will find 0 examples, right? So AI writing novels is apparently something that people enjoy doing, but not something people enjoy reading. That's very weird, right? People are super enthusiastic about playing with AI, and yet they have no interest whatsoever in looking at the results. I mean, just think about your own personal experience. I find it deeply interesting to play with AI, to get it to do things, to role play, to ask it questions, to get it to interrogate myself and get my assumptions straightened out. But I don't bother sharing the transcript with anyone else because it's like sharing a dream. People find that incredibly boring. So I think AI as a medium is about appealing to the individual. It's more like a conversation with a friend or a meal than a painting or a novel. The real joy of AI is in exploring subjectivities and in enhancing your own subjectivity rather than looking at the result. I think AI-written novels will never be interesting so long as AI is architected as it currently is. But I think playing with AI and trying to come up with new forms of art in which exploring your own subjectivity is the appeal, that can be really interesting.
Just that to end this conversation, the bit about AI and the analogy to a camera, the fact that a camera was the progenitor for the birth of cinema, which today is the highest grossing form of art. And to think that it took 100 years since the camera was born for the first photo exhibition to take place in Boston's Art Museum. So now imagine AI and how we use with Midjourney, with Sora, with ChatGPT. In 100 years, who knows what stories or what forms of storytelling it will have developed that we could never imagine as humans. So Ken, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. And I'm going to leave you with one last thought that Ken has, which is hope crafting. So here in Ken's view of the world and of technology, AI isn't something to be feared, but is something that we can use to build better futures. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you very much.